Bonjour, Kinawaya. My name is Jesse McCormick. I'm from Deshkan-Zibi, Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. Very pleased to welcome you to this exciting LinkedIn event hosted by the First Nations Major Projects Coalition with our special guest, John Stackhouse, to discuss the upcoming 7th Annual First Nations Major Projects Coalition, Our Collective Advantage Indigenous Consent conference taking place on April 22nd and 23rd in Toronto at the Sheridan Centre Toronto Hotel. We're very excited to be hosting that event. We're very excited to have you here with us today. It's a good day, and we're excited to have these discussions. So I have the pleasure of introducing John Stackhouse, who is joining us today from the Royal Bank of Canada. John is the Senior Vice President, Office of the CEO. He hosts an excellent podcast called Disruptors, which is hosted by RBC, and he leads RBC's Economics and Thought Leadership Group. He's responsible for gathering and interpreting global economic, political, and social trends and providing the executive leadership team and board of directors with insights on how these issues are affecting RBC, its clients, and society at large. We're going to take a benefit of some of John's experience and knowledge. We're going to discuss First Nations participation, Indigenous consent, the content of our Collective Advantage conference, and we're looking forward to hearing some questions from the audience as well as we move later into the presentation. Very much appreciate RBC joining us both for this event, but also for the FNMPC conference as our title sponsor. We move forward with the support of our sponsors, and RBC is helping to lead the charge in that respect. Welcome, John. Thanks for being here today. Would you like to say a few words to say hello to everyone?
Hey, Jesse. Great to be with you. Thanks for welcoming me into this conversation. Really looking forward to your questions, but also hearing from all the people who will be joining us. And thank you also for the partnership that we're developing through the First Nations Major Project Coalition. We're really excited about the conference in April. Our CEO will be speaking. A lot of our business leaders are leaning into it, and we think it's actually going to be a very cool moment to bring together Indigenous leadership and business corporate leadership in the country.
Excellent. Well, I am joining you all from Secwepemcúlecw, the unceded and traditional territory of the Secwepemc people. I'm here on the reserve in Kamloops, just outside Kamloops, British Columbia, in the southern interior. And to tell you a little bit about our conference, the title line is Our Collective Advantage, Indigenous Consent. Looking at Indigenous consent as an advantage to businesses, as an advantage to government, and certainly as an advantage to Indigenous peoples. It's a 2-day event. It will be action-packed. Come rested and ready for lots of networking. We're having discussions around reconciliation and the role of the financial sector. We're looking at free, prior, and informed consent. We'll be discussing small modular reactors and the opportunity for Indigenous participation in the nuclear sector. Critical minerals will be part of the discussions, electrification, and many opportunities to discuss how Indigenous values can help to drive the mobilization of capital to the construction of major infrastructure here in Canada that will help Canada achieve net zero objectives. So to explore a few of those ideas, John, I think we should dive right in. The Inflation Reduction Act, United States of America, had a significant impact on Canada's ability to compete in industries that will drive the green economy. We're seeing some really important developments and really significant opportunities for Indigenous participation here in Canada. How can Indigenous economic participation help to strengthen Canada's ability to compete in the industries that will drive the green economy?
It's a great question to kick off with, Jesse, because reconciliation, more broadly economic reconciliation, including some of the issues we'll be talking about today, should be an asset for Canada. This is not a burden or an obstacle. Some of the decisions that we need to work through are of course challenging, but I hope Canadians and those joining us see this as a real opportunity for Canada in a lower emissions and ultimately net zero economy that is also more inclusive. And I'm sorry, I should have also kicked off by recognizing that I'm joining you today from Toronto and the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And it's an honor and privilege to be on this territory, to work, live, and play. You ask a great question about the Inflation Reduction Act, which has actually been with us for less than 2 years. I think it's hard to believe, because it seems such a key part of the fabric now in terms of climate conversations. We need to recognize as a country in Canada that we are still well behind the United States in terms of fiscal supports for what we would call climate action. A lot has been pledged and committed in Canada, including investment tax credits, which we hope will be advanced this year. So it's not like we're sitting still not doing anything. But one of the key components of IRA, as the Inflation Reduction Act is now colloquially known, is its speed and its cash up front component, where essentially project proponents, regardless of ownership, are getting money from Washington as soon as they essentially file. Versus here in Canada, where you've got to sort of demonstrate and actually build things to then probably claim your credits. So we're seeing investors shift very quickly because of that incentive. A lot of Canadian investors, owners of capital, saying we're very interested and would like to invest in Canada, but right now all of our investment is going to the U.S. This is whether it's carbon capture or hydrogen or renewables, and also whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous. One of the key components of IRA, which is probably overlooked or just missed by a lot of Canadians, is the eligibility for American Indigenous communities, Indian bands in the U.S. to claim a lot of these credits and actually do fairly well in terms of mobilizing capital for these projects. So we should be looking over our shoulder or across the lake in the case of those, for those of us here in Toronto, to see to take note, more than see, take note of how quickly the U.S. is moving.
That's fantastic. Well, so you've been in the banking sector for a while now, but prior, in a former life, you were an editor. You worked for the Globe and Mail. You were a journalist. You were helping to tell stories and bringing ideas and discussions to Canadians. I want to lean in on your experience as a storyteller. It forms part of your work today at RBC through Disruptors and helping to carry the message of RBC. But how do we, recognizing that competitive challenge of the United States having made major fiscal investments at a scale that really no other country can compete on, but utilizing the story of First Nations economic participation, how can we tell that story in a way that's going to resonate with the investment community, but also particularly international capital markets?
It boils down to a lot of things, but there's one word that really towers over many others, and that's equity. So how do we start to embrace equity as part of the Canadian story, and certainly central to the Indigenous story? Equity involves ownership. It's about more than that. But I love the expression. I've learned this from Crystal Smith and Charlene Gale and other incredible Indigenous leaders in this country, that everything we do now needs to be connected to say and share, especially in resource development. So Indigenous communities need to not only have a say in how things are built, they need to have a share of ownership. And in fact, those two go really well hand in hand. And we're starting to see these stories flourish in the country. A couple of examples. Look at what's happened here in Ontario with Hydro One and its 50/50 initiative, which allows for, and in fact encourages, Indigenous communities to own up to 50% of a hydro line running through their territory. We're seeing this in a lot of resource development projects, well, across the country, but certainly in Alberta and British Columbia, where it's now is pretty standard, like at the beginning, to talk about what the Indigenous ownership will be, what that equity will be. This can become a really cool story to tell the planet. That if we talk about inclusion, which seems like a buzzword in a lot of conversations and seems devoid of actually the human component that should be what inclusion is all about. Well, we could be developing a model for inclusion in this country through Indigenous equity, where we can say to the world that whether you're developing an energy project, renewable energy projects, forestry projects, mines, critical minerals, there's going to be Indigenous ownership in that at a scale. I hope we can get to that scale this decade that's unparalleled in the world. And that's going to be a unique value proposition for Canada. So if you want to invest in the journey to net zero, including whether it's critical minerals or renewable energy or other assets, we have those assets, those resources in Canada, better than arguably anywhere else in the world. And you can invest in those, carbon capture, hydrogen, here in Canada, alongside Indigenous owners who are not only going to have, you hear that people talk about patient capital. Indigenous equity is really patient capital. This is communities, and I've been able to work with a number of them who think 7 generations, to use the term, but think generationally about capital and about investment. That's what so many investors around the world want. They want to be side by side or supporting those who are thinking generationally, but then also who bring a stewardship to the projects. So if I'm investing from Timbuktu or Wall Street or wherever in Canada, it's going to build my confidence that there's a community that not only owns or co-owns the project, and therefore is going to have a stronger interest in its economic success. They're going to steward it and ensure that it has a sustainability quotient to it that is important to me as an investor, and is unfortunately a bit rare in our world today.
In order to move forward with those investments, you mentioned one of the big challenges that First Nations Major Projects Coalition members face is access to capital. Being able to access capital at reasonable rates, to be able to mobilize that capital towards the investments necessary to see long-term revenue streams for First Nations, and also the ability to take risks for business advantage. We're really excited about the opportunity for Canada to move forward with an Indigenous loan guarantee program. Back in the budget of 2023, Canada committed, I think it was $8.7 million to support engagement with First Nations or Indigenous partners to develop a national benefit sharing program. And then in November 2023, in the fall economic statement, the government of Canada committed to advancing the development of an Indigenous loan guarantee with the details to follow. In budget 2024. So we're all watching out for budget 2024. We're looking for the opportunity for Indigenous peoples to access that capital. It builds on ideas like the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, similar structures in Saskatchewan and Ontario, all of that coming to play with the opportunity for First Nations to access capital in a new way. And from a bank's perspective, if you have access to an Indigenous loan guarantee, how does that change things for First Nations seeking access to capital? If you've got one First Nation that shows up with Indigenous loan guarantee opportunity and one that doesn't, what are they looking at in terms of differentiated opportunities? What does it do to interest rates? How does it change the game for First Nations?
So a very basic but critical part of banking is, as everyone listening would know, is your credit score, and that depends on your balance sheet. Doesn't matter if you're a big corporation or an individual looking for a line of credit or a mortgage. And Indigenous communities, while they often have enormous economic strengths and are great financial partners, we've seen through generations, often don't have that credit rating and that balance sheet that capital markets look for. Sometimes they legally can't have particularly that balance sheet to borrow against. What a loan guarantee does, and I'm oversimplifying here, but it takes our collective balance sheet, Canada's balance sheet, but you've mentioned some provinces, Alberta particularly, that have already done this, and said we will kind of use our balance sheet, lend our balance sheet, if you will, to communities, First Nations in this case, by guaranteeing the loan. So then a nation can come to us and say, we need $100 million to buy a share of whatever project it is. So we're going to assess the value of the project, of course, see what kind of returns there are with it, make sure that it's a sustainable project, make sure it meets other factors that go into our risk assessments, including environmental factors. But in terms of the financial risk for the community, when you have that guarantee, that makes it much more comfortable for a bank or any lender to say, okay, if for whatever reason this doesn't work out, the government of Canada or the government of Alberta is going to cover the loan. We haven't seen any risk of that at all in the loans that we've made, but it's important for us to have that cushion, if you will, or that safety net. Importantly, what it does is reduces the cost of capital, the cost of borrowing for communities. So for communities that don't have that guarantee, it's not like they can't get a loan, but what happens is they'll have to pay more for the loan. It's like if your credit rating is not as strong as your neighbors, or you don't have the income, say to support your mortgage, you're probably going to pay a higher rate for your mortgage or for your line of credit. Doesn't mean you're not going to get one. So we see out in the market Indigenous communities having to pay more, and it can be like 100 to 150 basis points, like a full percentage point more than they would with that kind of guarantee. And sometimes the returns on a project are attractive enough that communities are willing to pay that. But and we've been sharing this with governments, that's kind of a hidden tax on Indigenous communities who, through the dent of history, and it's not their history, it's our collective history, they do not have that sovereign guarantee, that sovereign balance sheet that the government of Canada has, and therefore they have to pay more for a loan. Well, that's unfair, and it also doesn't make economic sense. So how do we kind of underpin those communities with the sovereign balance sheet of the country so that they not only access more capital, they pay a much more competitive rate and save that 100, 150 basis points, which collectively, by the way, adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars a year when we look out through the decade of the amount of opportunity in this space. So how do we collectively see that as an unfair hidden tax on Indigenous communities that we can, through this loan guarantee, remove?
So I'm hearing you're supportive of this idea of an Indigenous loan guarantee, John. You and your
Absolutely.
RBC. Yeah. It's a good idea. We think it's a good idea too. And I think it's going to be a game changer for a lot of First Nations that want to raise the capital necessary to be full participants in the Canadian economy. One of the things we're exploring at FNMPC, and we haven't yet put out any publications, but it's starting to form an idea, is this idea around considering the cost of reconciliation in project development and looking at, in the same way that added capital costs through increased interest rates associated with the deprivations of the Indian Act can be a barrier to First Nations participation. There's a long history and legacy of negative impacts from Indigenous policy on Indigenous communities and their ability to participate in the economy and the green economy especially. When thinking about project development and thinking about First Nations participation, developing an understanding of how that can contribute to reconciliation and offer the public good of helping to rectify some of those challenges. How do you see the trajectory of Indigenous economic participation helping to inform and improve the lives of Indigenous peoples?
Ownership is a foundational part of our economy. It's a foundational part of a capitalist society, and even a social capitalist society rests on ownership. We have home ownership, we have car ownership, we have equity ownership, company ownership in our society, and think about all that emanates from that. Some negatives, but for the most part, positives in terms of the advancement, what we call progress of a society. Yet, for all the progress that we have made as a country, among the many shortcomings, which is an understatement, in terms of Indigenous populations, is a lack of ownership. And we're starting to rectify that. And that's part of economic reconciliation. But this is not what some people may unfairly see as kind of reparations. That's kind of the wrong view of this. This is the distribution of assets as they rightfully should be, owned, managed, controlled by those who have long held some form of title or ownership and stewardship of those resources. That ownership through the equity models that we've been talking about is going to be really important to the sustainable development of resources in our country, which is a really important part of Canada's economy. But in that transition to net zero, we need to manage and develop the resources that we have much more sustainably, thoughtfully, and in a climate-minded way than we have in the past. Indigenous ownership is going to help with that, as well as help with the economic reconciliation.
It's fantastic. One of the things we see from Indigenous economic participation, particularly equity, is the alignment of interests. So as projects are moving forward and navigating regulatory processes, looking for capital, securing support from local communities and governments to do big things, having Indigenous partners that are aligned in the objective of getting that project built and getting that project moving forward can be a powerful factor in terms of timelines, budget, and reputation, and many good things can come from it. So we've got, within the FNMPC, a lot of First Nations that are very excited about the opportunity to partner, and securing that access to capital is going to be a big part of the success. And we're really excited to see an Indigenous loan guarantee program laid out in budget 2024. Excited to see what comes out of the government of Canada. But as we talked about, you mentioned ownership, control, opportunity to participate. Some of that has been the product of a developed jurisprudence in Canada, a changing landscape in terms of the recognition of Indigenous rights, greater confidence in Indigenous communities to take ownership and leadership and exercise decision-making power in relation to projects. One of the sessions at the FNMPC conference that I'm really excited about is one on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We've called it UN-driven free, prior, informed consent, the making of the Declaration. And we're bringing in James Anaya, the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We've got my old boss, David Lametti, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General and former MP for Lasarda Emal Verdun. And we got Smogot Delgamuk from the Gitxsan, and moderated by our good friend Dan George from Four Directions Management. And the question I have for you is, how do you see the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free, prior, and informed consent shaping how banks interact with major infrastructure projects in Canada in the future?
One of the aspects of this conference that we're so excited and honored to be part of is the focus on consent. That is the kind of the title theme of the conference, and that was critical, or among the critical factors for RBC to try to be a leading and wanting to be a leading part of the of the conference. Consent is it's an interesting word, and it's a word that Canadians should get more comfortable with. And the ambiguity around consent is also something Canadians are probably going to have to get more comfortable with. And that's difficult for certain kind of actors in an economy. You talked about jurisprudence, companies, investors, regulators looking for clear lines and wanting to know in advance, because that clarity allows them to make significant investments with less risk. The challenge with consent is there's probably not going to be that kind of black and white, pardon the expression if that's not the right one, but clarity around what consent means. It is very much varies by community, by region, and also evolves with time. And I've learned this from a lot of Indigenous leaders, but also a lot of thoughtful companies who know that the consent they might have had 5 years ago at a certain stage of a project may not equate to consent today. And so therefore it's something you always have to invest in. You have to engage in. You can't just say, okay, we've got consent. There's the signatures on the paper. Please file that with our lawyers in case anyone says you don't have consent. It's it's kind of like a relationship. You just don't make a commitment and then that's it. You need to invest in the relationship in a forever way and constantly build on it. Trust is core to that, but engagement, listening is also critical to it. So I think this is a chance. This conference is a good chance for us as a bank with our clients to learn. We're coming to listen and learn what others see as content, but also to share these conversations with others and see this not as something to kind of leave to your lawyers to tell you that you've got consent or whatever the objective is, but to understand that it's part of the relationship, and as listening is part of any good relationship. And we need to continue to learn how to build these relationships, build trust, and with that, consent will come.
John, you mentioned early in our conversation that the CEO from RBC will be joining us for the conference. Any sneak peeks into what we might hear? Any key messages or ideas that RBC will be exploring as part of the FNMPC conference?
Yeah, so Dave Mackay, our CEO, will be appearing with Charlene Gale, who's a great leader in the country as well as with FNMPC, and they'll talk about all these issues. And I'm keen to listen and hear what they say. But I think Dave is keen to hear from Charlene, but then also talk about what the opportunities are, how he's seeing billions of dollars of capital waiting and wanting to be invested in these opportunities. So how do we in this room, in these conversations, build more ambitious, more collective ambition to bring in those billions of dollars of investment that all of Canada needs, but that Indigenous communities can lever to help us all with economic reconciliation.
I'd look to the crowd. We've got, if you look to the question, you can put some questions into the comment box that you see on your screens, and we'd love to explore some of those with John. And I see some starting to pop up. But before we do, John, I wanted to touch base with you about a recent report from RBC called Double or Trouble. Everyone in Canada will need to double down to hit the 2030 climate goals. What's needed to hit Canada's 2030 climate goals is the theme you've explored. There's a good chunk on there in reconciliation. One thing that really stood out to me was the finding that business leaders believe they can achieve their climate goals. So we see that ambition, we see that optimism, we see that planning and structuring of operations to achieve climate goals. How is that factoring into the movement of capital in the country, and how is it influencing where the puck is going in terms of Canada's industrial development, and where do you see that trajectory over time?
We are making progress as a country, and that's an important message from the report for Canadians. We're not making enough progress. We're not moving fast enough. We're not moving at a scale we need to. But we are moving in the right direction. We are seeing more determination from business, and we're hearing this from clients in real estate, in agriculture, as well as in traditional energy sectors. We're seeing it in power and utilities. Business leaders and investors saying this is where the puck is going. There are tens of billions of dollars available from their investment base to invest in these projects that are going to drive growth, that are going to drive better returns. And that's encouraging to see that kind of business enthusiasm. Back to the first question about IRA, we need to move faster collectively on all sorts of things. And we need to understand what our competitive advantages are as a country. That includes Indigenous ownership. And that equity component that we talked about. It includes our ability to sustainably develop resources, whether it's oil and gas or forest products or critical minerals, and to have Indigenous communities play a leading role in that. That's a real advantage for Canada, but we need to move together and move faster.
So with that, and with the work you've done in that area and some of the examination in terms of Indigenous participation, are you seeing increased Indigenous participation in any particular sectors of the green economy? Like where are Indigenous peoples showing the most interest and the most opportunity to get involved?
So we see it in a range of sectors. Oil and gas is an important one, and we think part of the transition of the oil and gas sector, which is critical to Canada reaching its climate targets and its net zero ambitions. We're going to have to do it with the oil and gas sector, but Indigenous equity in the oil and gas sector is going to be critical. That includes equity in decarbonization activities like carbon capture. We see it in real estate. You see this in big centers like Vancouver, where some of the biggest property owners and developers are now Indigenous communities. That's wonderful. And we're seeing international investors actually come to Canada and saying, we'd like to be part of that. If a local Indigenous community owns that shopping mall or that condo development or that new subdivision, we'd like to invest in that because they've got a long-term view. And guess what? Real estate is all about a long-term view. And they're going to steward it in a fairly responsible way. So some of the world's biggest investors are now looking at markets like Vancouver through that Indigenous Indigenous lens. We're seeing it in renewables. Battery storage is a really interesting opportunity. Wind and solar production, much of it on Indigenous territory or aligned with Indigenous territory, is a huge opportunity. Critical minerals, we think, is one of, state the obvious, is one of Canada's biggest needs if we're going to make the transition. But if you look at our research from RBC, it's fascinating to see the map of Canada and how the majority of top-notch critical mineral sites are on Indigenous implicated lands. Close to half the best wind and solar sites in the country, the same. So if you're thinking about net zero energy systems in the 2030s and 40s, you need to be thinking right out of the gate about Indigenous ownership in that, because it ain't going to happen without that.
That is exciting. And we do have some panels on critical minerals and some of the spaces that you've mentioned. So it is going to be a subject of discussion when we get to the conference, and there will be a lot of folks in the room that are. It's one of the things I really love about the FNMPC conference. There's what you see on the stage. There's also just the immense amount of talent and energy and the convening power of the FNMPC. Like the ability to get from the entry point to the coffee stand is very challenging because you're going to be bumping into people. You're going to be having conversations. You can interact with people from across the country that are all focused on making this process of Indigenous participation work. And it's something that is immensely exciting, and time goes by really fast. So think strategically when you come. Who do you want to meet up and where do you want to get some time in? But one question that came through the chat was, having recently attended several key forums internationally, I think you were at COP28, you're at Davos, how are the discussions around Indigenous reconciliation, the declaration, access to capital, et cetera, being reflected in the global economic stage and international markets? What have been the responses? Like, what do people know? What do they understand? What are they talking about? How's it going to impact Canada?
So glad you mentioned the conference, Jesse. I think the origin story, and correct me if I've got it wrong, but it started in, was it Prince George, 7-8 years ago at the Days Inn, or maybe it was a Best Western, and it's that recent. And I was I've been lucky enough to know a number of the leaders of the coalition for a few years, and went to the conference last year in Vancouver and was blown away. I didn't have any great expectations, and like you said, like just walk in the door and you're immediately like, wow, this is a big deal. Like there are thousands of people here, thousands. They took over the Bayshore, one of the nicest hotels in Vancouver. Like took it over. It was packed,
and corporate leaders, government leaders, part of it, and a real energy to the conference that you don't get at some conferences. People were there to not just meet new people, but to drive business, to drive policy, to push these things forward. So yeah, come well rested, as you say, Jesse, but come with ambition, come to get stuff done for yourself, for your community, for your company, and for the country. It's a place to get stuff done. Interesting to see the level of Indigenous attention now in other conferences. You mentioned COP28, which I was lucky to attend in Dubai in December. And you might be surprised, in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, in the middle of the Middle East, at a COP conference, the amount of focus on Indigenous issues, on rights, but also on that equity component. And that's where I think, Canada, we're kind of like missing a beat here. We're missing an opportunity, because we should be, just like that enthusiasm, that energy, that ambition that I mentioned at FNMPC. We should be showing up at COP. So think of COP29, COP30. We should be showing up saying, "Hey, world, like, you want to talk about Indigenous equity? We're the leaders in that." And it's not just talk. Here's kind of a list of projects that are up and running, and here's the billions and billions of dollars that has been leveraged and that is regenerating capital and leading to more billions to be invested in new energy systems, in new approaches to property development, to new food systems, all the things we want and need for the decades ahead. We should be showing up at COP, I think, with that ambition and that message to the world, and that story to the world, that we are world leaders in inclusion, in economic reconciliation, and in Indigenous ownership.
It is good to hear that is the conversation taking place in those places, John. I'm glad that you'll be there, hopefully to help carry some of that message forward, as I'm sure you'll continue on those circuits. Taking questions from the audience, Kevin Mullen is asking us about the risk return elements for First Nations. So a lot of the discussion is around mature investments, early asset-backed, lower risk, getting in at kind of the post-construction or post-green light stage. So things are more or less locked in and the risk is minimal, versus opportunities for venture capital or earlier investments where First Nations might take on a higher level of risk but potentially see higher returns. Where do you see First Nations investing most of their time, and where is the most of the opportunity?
Of course, it depends on the nation, on the region, on the communities within the nation. There's no kind of one size fits all, or one approach is even appropriate for such a diversity of communities and nations across the country. We've seen a lot of interest in regulated returns, regulated rates of return. So you think of hydro transmission as an example, or a gas pipeline, where you're going to have a fairly predictable rate of return on it, even a regulated rate of return. Investors love that. Pension funds love that, because they can put down their $1 billion and know that over the next 25 years, they're probably going to get a yield of payment that's fairly predictable. It's essentially a rent. And for a lot of communities, that's very attractive, because that is kind of like the equivalent of a pension fund. This is our generational wealth. We don't want to gamble it on kind of what the next Facebook is going to be, even though the returns may be higher. So I hear from a lot of communities that rightly and understandably so say, like, I need to ensure that the capital I'm investing today is going to be there for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and their grandchildren. And that requires a rate of return to grow, because everyone understands inflation. So you can't just put it in a box and bury it. But you can't take a high risk bet with it either. So understandably, a lot of communities are going to be looking for that. And in all the development projects that we've been talking about, there's plenty of opportunity there. You just think of the electrification of the country. We're going to need to double to triple the amount of electricity supply in the country over the next 25 years if we're going to get to net zero? Well, electricity is largely regulated in the country. There's predictable rates of return on that. So a really good opportunity for Indigenous capital. But it's not one size fits all. There are other communities across the country that do want to take a greater risk, not just for the reward, but because of different values that they may attach to something that is perhaps more speculative. And that could be, as I mentioned, battery storage. That could be real estate development, where they're willing, as I say, to take that risk to get a higher rate of return, but also to be involved in different parts of the economy that may be more relevant to those populations. Say for an urban community, it's going to have probably a different social dynamic and different generational expectations than a rural community. That's not a blanket statement, but that is an observation. And we need to ensure that as a society, but also in the financial system, that we are ensuring access to capital across the risk spectrum. And of course, you're going to pay differently for that. I think everyone expects that and gets that. But let's ensure that Indigenous communities that do want to take those higher risk investments fully understand that you can lose a lot of your capital that way, but that you have access to those pools of riskier capital, as well as access to the more secure pools of capital.
So there's the capacity, the financial capacity to participate, the ability to buy into the project, secure your equity opportunity. You've got to fund it, but then there's also the capacity that exists within First Nations to participate in those types of exchanges. The corporate legal structuring, the transactional capacity, the business analysis, the work that needs to go into essentially ensuring that First Nations have a capacity that is good or better than the partners that cross the table that they're trying to work with in order to participate. It is something that is part of the heart and soul of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, a space that the genesis of our organization has been to help address that question, ensure that capacity is there, and then utilizing that capacity to help secure opportunities for First Nations. But it's not just a role for First Nations. There's a role for government. There's a role for the banking sector. There's a role for corporate Canada. What opportunities do you see in terms of industry and corporate participation in relation to helping to raise those capacities within First Nations?
Yeah, it's such a critical challenge, Jesse. I've been taken aback by the difference in capacity that you see between communities, and maybe you shouldn't be surprised by this, but even within a region. So an example is the Coastal GasLink pipeline in British Columbia, where there's 20 communities roughly that want to buy a collective 10% share of the pipeline. The communities range from the Haisla, who are among the most sophisticated business operators you'll find anywhere. The leaders are off in Japan and Korea every few months negotiating export deals with some of the world's biggest companies. They're raising significant amounts of capital. They're investing that capital. So you go from that community to interior communities that you literally can only reach by boat. That may be a couple of hundred people. They're not going to have the capacity to negotiate the contracts the way that the Haisla do. So how do we ensure that there's that access to those skills? Some of it is within the community and helping communities develop that talent, whether it's through the chief and council and formal structures, but also never underestimate the importance of the whole community to understand where their capital, because it is their capital, right? It's not one person's capital, it's the community's capital. It is generational capital. And therefore, everyone in the community, more or less, this comes back to the importance of consent being an ongoing conversation, is going to have to understand, I shouldn't say have to understand, they want to understand the complexities to a degree and the intricacies of a business arrangement. That doesn't mean that every village and community is going to have its own kind of law firm, its own investment banking arm, and on and on. But at least a bit of the financial literacy, let's say, to know and understand the direction of travel. Then how do we, in addition, help build the institutional capacity across nations and across communities to negotiate and manage these new kinds of relationships, business relationships? There's a lot of good things going on across the country, but as we think about the Indigenous loan guarantee, one of the critical components, and I think the federal government will recognize this in the upcoming budget, will be the need for that capacity building. How do we help whoever's involved here ensure that that capacity building is not kind of stuck in some bureaucratic labyrinth and inaccessible to people? How do we ensure that it is accessible, it is relevant to the community, it has that storytelling component, it has a fluency with the social and cultural dynamics of a community and of a region, and is not locked away in some ivory tower, or you've got to enroll in some special course to access those skills. So big challenge for the country, and not one that we should underinvest in.
The comments about the Haisla Nation really resonate with me. I had the immense privilege of being legal counsel to the Haisla Nation on the Northern Gateway pipeline, and you can just see the impacts of, one, the capacity that exists there, and the leadership from former Chief Counselor Ellis Ross, from Crystal Smith, the current Chief Counselor, and from the entire council and the administration and the supports that they've built around them. The ability to move forward with projects like Cedar LNG, from Canada LNG, just that investment capacity, but also the strong principles grounded in culture and community that really help First Nations to be the leaders in discussions about sustainable development in Canada. And we're seeing that in that capacity grow and expand across the country. And you recently described, I think it was in relation to technology, the current decade is a decade of innovation on Disruptors recently on a podcast. And we see innovation and opportunity in relation to technology. But the question of innovation in social policy, we've discussed some of the tools, Indigenous loan guarantees, some of what you've discussed and what we've shared here in relation to Indigenous capacity to participate in the transactional discussions that you need to participate in to become partners in the projects that need to get built to achieve net zero. But where do you see opportunities in further innovation in social policy for Indigenous peoples? Where would you like to be in 10 years looking back?
Certainly in terms of access, the ability of communities in disparate and distant parts of the country to have more level access to information and to decision-making tools. AI is actually really powerful in this front. We all get a little kind of rattled or even freaked out by ChatGPT. Well, ChatGPT is the most incredible assistant any and all of us can have. And think about the opportunities that then brings to that remote fishing community that I mentioned that can be accessed only by boat. Well, if we invest in broadband, we got to do a lot more on that front. People in those communities can work with ChatGPT to get level access to information that downtown law firms right now may control or be the gatekeepers to. ChatGPT and generative AI can help communities, and it's not that simple, I recognize that, but you can see opportunities start to emerge on the horizon. Generative AI can help distant communities that may not have the tech savvy access both information but also decision-making tools to understand, is this something I should do? Or if we are thinking about doing A, B, and C, what are the D, E, and F consequences that we should be thinking about? Well, you can go hire some fancy pants lawyer to give you an opinion about that. Or you can use generative AI tools, which are smarter than all the fancy pants lawyers put together on certain files, to actually give you a pretty good read on it. And hopefully if we develop generative AI properly, can be accessible in different languages and with different communications capabilities, i.e. you don't need to be an English-speaking lawyer to understand a document. It can be translated quite literally and verbally and even visually, lots of risks there as well, but also potential for different communities to absorb and understand complex choices in their own way.
We're quickly burning through our time here, John. I think we got time for maybe one more audience question, a wrap up from you and a quick wrap up from me, but maybe two. One of the questions we have is about indicators of success or indicators of failure. I'd like to focus on the positive. So the bank is looking at multiple opportunities to support investment in a major project. You've got different players, you've got different projects, you've got different Indigenous groups that are seeking support in terms of capital. What are some of the indicators of success that you're looking for in a project that makes it attractive for investment at a reasonable rate?
So it's usually a kind of complex series of variables, but that point about consent that we talked about is fundamental. Power of partnerships is really important. Seeing communities partnering with large corporates, with infrastructure operators, as well as financial backers is really important. This is becoming a bit of a measure for companies as well, where we see big corporations that are really terrific at working with Indigenous communities and vice versa. That makes them more compelling as an investment opportunity, and I think they now recognize that. And we see others, not naming names here, who don't have that record or don't even kind of express an interest in developing those kinds of partnerships. Well, that becomes a different conversation.
Well, to close us off here, John, I'll ask you for just your closing thoughts, but with a specific request. Part of coming to Toronto was about expanding our scope. We've got a growing membership across the country. We started with around 10 First Nations in the interior of British Columbia, and we've grown to over 150 First Nation members from across the country. And we want to make sure that we're communicating effectively with the capital markets, the investment community, the banking community, and a lot of that is situated in Toronto. So as a person working in that space, what advantages will people see from coming to the FNMPC conference, spending that time, engaging with the people, hearing from the presentations? What will they have that they wouldn't have had if they didn't come? Why should they be there?
So meeting new people. I mean, this conference is going to bring together people from across the country, but also around the world that you wouldn't maybe meet easily otherwise. So see this as an opportunity to meet new people, to get informed on some of these cutting edge issues. We've been talking about the tens of billions of dollars. So our recent report called Double or Trouble, this is the State of Canadian Climate Action 2024 from the RBC Climate Action Institute. Our report shows we have to get from $22.5 billion of capital last year to $60 billion of capital going into climate action in investments. A lot of that is going to be Indigenous owned or Indigenous influenced in different ways. So if you are at all interested in anything going on in the climate space, and you're at all interested in helping to mobilize the tens of billions of dollars that we need to get to net zero for all these incredible opportunities and technologies that we've been talking about, this conference is going to be central for those conversations. And then thirdly, if you want to bring together people from different parts of society, different parts of the country, people with different perspectives, if you want to be one of the many connectors who we're going to need in building on all this, what a great place to help us all by taking us forward in your own way.
John, we at the FNMPC really appreciate your time. Royal Bank of Canada, as our title sponsor for this conference, is demonstrating leadership and a knowledge and an understanding of what's actually happening out there. We're hearing from First Nations all the time about the opportunity to participate, how they want to be involved, how they have a contribution to make, and how they want to ensure that they're exercising stewardship and sustainability within their traditional territories. And it's workplaces like RBC that's helping to make that happen. For those of you who took the time to join us today, we express our chimigwech for your time, for your energy, for your focus. We want you to come to this conference. We think you will benefit from it. We will benefit from having you there. It is our collective advantage. Indigenous consent, exploring Indigenous consent is an advantage for businesses, for Indigenous peoples, for government, and for Canada as we move forward on this reconciliation journey. It is in April on the 22nd and 23rd at the Sheridan Centre, Hotel Toronto. You'll see the link below. Check it out. Please plan to come join us. We're very excited about having you there and about the opportunity to share with you. It's going to be a fantastic agenda. John, chimigwech to you and the team at RBC. Thank you to Sedgwick Strategies for helping to support our work today. And thank you to all of you for joining us in this important discussion. Jesse
McCormick, thank you.